All right, well, thanks for coming. How long, does anybody know how long it's been since I was here last?
4 or 5 years.
Oh, it's more than 2 years, yeah. Yeah, four? Is it only 4? All right. I have a hard time keeping track, you know, like I just kind of go around. But, you know, since then we've had, you know, our shop's in a new spot, so we had some kind of big changes about 3 years ago. If you haven't been to the new shop, come check it out. It's actually pretty cool. You know, and during COVID, we didn't get to, you know, we did a lot of Zoom stuff, so I wasn't able to do a lot of these in-person demos. So, you know, just really in the last 6 months or so have I started, I guess I did a couple last winter, just a couple though. So these are kind of, you know, becoming new again. So, you know, my program is, you know, pretty loose. I've got a set of flies that I'm going to do for you, just trying to mix it up. I'll be in Fort Worth tomorrow night, so I'm going to try not to do the exact same program. So if you come tomorrow night, you'll see at least some stuff that's different. But if you have questions along the way, shout them out. I'll kind of, you know, I'll give you all the details I can of these flies that I'm going to do. And if I get long-winded, how late will they let you be here?
They don't serve breakfast.
All right, we'll finish well before 10. Well before 10. So I'll kind of tell you the stories of how I came up with these flies, and I think that's the interesting part. You know, not everybody ties flies, but you know, all of my flies, and I think it's fairly unique, and I think that's one of the reasons that my flies become so popular is that they solve a problem. And you know, somebody was just asking me. I did what was I doing? I did a podcast with Trouts, which is one of the other fly shops in town in Denver. You know, a couple guys over there do a 5 flies for each month series, and really great young guys. We had a great time doing it. But they, you know, one of the questions they asked was like, how do you sit down? What do you do when you sit down to come up with a new pattern? And to be perfectly honest with you, I don't ever sit down to come up with a new pattern. You know, that idea starts when I'm fishing. You know, a fly that I'm fishing and it didn't float as well as I wanted, or I needed it to sink faster, or I needed it to swim different, or I needed it to cast better. So new flies, for me anyway, come from trying to solve a problem, make something better, make it do whatever it is that it's supposed to do better or more efficiently. And that's sort of my thought process on it. And I think every one of these, I'm just cheating off my list here. I'm old now, so I have to sit. This is the perfect distance for me to read that note. Every one of those flies is a problem-solved fly. The first one I'll do for you, and I don't know if you guys have probably seen this one before. It's a hugely popular fly. It's a 2-bit hooker. So it's a simple fly. It's not a hard fly to tie. People do always ask me about the legs, and I'll show you a couple tricks on those. But what the 2-bit hooker is a two tungsten beaded little mayfly nymph. And the whole idea behind that fly is I was fishing the Arkansas, which is fairly fast pocket water. So you're fishing a dry dropper rig. Usually I'll fish a Charlie Boy hopper or a Boy Wonder hopper, which I'll tie tomorrow, if you want to see that. See, I've wrapped that all together. But fishing a hopper with a dropper under, and with a regular, you know, brass bead dropper was nowhere near heavy enough. Even a tungsten bead, oversized tungsten bead, I just didn't feel like the fly was getting down quick enough in those short drifts. You know, on a fly that you've got a long drift on, you can have a fairly light fly and it'll still have time to sink and get down and kind of sweep along the bottom. But in a short drift, you need a fly that plummets, that hangs straight down quickly. So I spent an inordinate amount of time trying to figure out how to make a little skinny mayfly heavier. And you know, adding lead wire to it didn't work. You know, that took away from the skinny. And it took me way too long to figure out to just use 2 beads. And once I did, yeah, it's pretty obvious, isn't it? Seems like a perfectly reasonable thing to do to make the fly twice as heavy, put 2 beads on it. And once I did do that, the fly was great. The fly worked really well. I didn't really think Uncle was ever going to pick the fly up because it'd be a $3 or $3.50 fly with those 2 tungsten beads. But since then, this fly and the Juju betas pretty much alternate between being my best-selling patterns, and they sell piles of them. You know, the scope of fly sales in the world, I had no idea. You know, 20 years ago, I had no idea what the scope of fly sales in the world are. But they, you know, back when I tied commercially, I'd tie 3,000 to 5,000 dozen flies a year. Umpqua sells 5,000 dozen 2-bit hookers per quarter. So all those flies that I tied for a year, they do in a quarter of one. So this is a much better deal for me. You know, that also, these days I don't tie commercially anymore. I'll tie custom orders for the shop and things like that. But it actually gives me a lot more time to kind of play and develop new stuff. So, so that's the story on the 2-bit hooker. You guys will learn to ask where the names came from on these, so I'll start with that. So this fly originally with the 2 beads on it was called a Beanie May. And if you're familiar with our old website, that's what it was. That's what I first put it up on the site as before it became a commercial fly. And my good friend Matt Krause, he and I fish all the time together. His wife's name is Bean. Her nickname is Bean. And one day he says to me, he said, he used to call this the beaded May. And he said, you should call that fly a Beanie May, after his wife. And I was like, that's a great idea. Yeah, well, let's do that. So when I submitted the fly to Umpqua, and the fly was the Beanie May for a year. When I submitted the fly to Umpqua, what they call the fly czar, the guy's name was Bruce Olson at the time, he said, that's a great fly, it's a terrible name, you need to come up with a different name. So I said, all right, I went home and I was looking at it, and I came up with 2-bit hooker, 2 beads, 2-bit hooker. I was like, that's a great name, that's awesome. So like a week later, I tell Matt that I had to change it. He's like, the fly you named after my wife is now called a 2-bit hooker. We're still friends, she's not mad. So. With that, I'll go ahead and tie one. And if you have questions along the way, if you have questions about any of it along the way, just kind of shout them out. A lot of times I'm looking down here, so I'm not always looking back up. I try to. But if you have questions along the way, just holler them out. And I'll try to... I assume everybody can hear me? Yes?
Can you think about substitute materials as you go along?
I-
What's critical and what's not?
What's critical and what's not?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm going to start with bead. Critical. Yeah, we're going to need the bead.
2 beads?
I'm going to use 2 of them on this one. Yeah. So I'm going to tie you a size 14. And on a 2-bit, the bead sizes vary with the hook size. So on a size 14, and this is a Tiemco 3769, all of this is on, I think you guys got the material list also, but there's videos of every one of these flies on our website. So you can write feverish notes if you want, but I already did it for you. But anyway, this is a size 14 3769. On a 14, they're 3/32 tungsten beads. On a 16, they're 5/64, and on an 18, they're 1/16. So I'm going to take 2 of these, and I'm going to tie a red one, so I'm going to use copper beads. I'm going to put both of them on conventionally. Get it around the bend there. Vice adjusted. So small hole toward the hook eye, just like you normally would, just 2 in a row. And I'm going to start with some red 70 denier UTC thread. The camera's on the other side. There we go. Now, here's something that I don't know if you guys have noticed. UTC thread comes from Wapsie over in Arkansas, and they've been terrible since COVID as far as delivery goes on anything. So this is like one of the rarest things in the world right now. Red thread is what you want. It doesn't have to be UTC. Dandel thread 6/0. Vivas 14/0 will work just fine. How many of y'all tie? Tell me how. Okay, good. All right. So, how many of you understand how thread sizes work? Liars. I don't understand how thread sizes work. So 14/0 Vivas thread would be much smaller than 70 denier UTC, wouldn't it? No, it wouldn't. It's because they all lie. There's no basis in the thread industry for thread size. 14/0 Vivas thread is about 68 denier. Denier is the weight in grams of 9,000 meters of thread. That's how the thread industry measures thread. So that's a good measurement, but what it doesn't tell you is what it's made out of. So this is nylon thread. UTC thread is nylon. Vivas thread is polyester. Polyester is heavier than nylon. But they're about the same size thread. They tie about the same. Threads are I wrote a big article on thread a couple of years ago that was in Fly Fisherman, and I'm sure it's still up on their website. But that was one of the things that has confused everybody for years and years. Those are my glasses. I'm looking on this other screen. What's there? There's no consistency between brands. So, company A says, my thread is size R. And the next company says, my thread is size 11. And there's no rhyme or reason to it. So, 14/0 Vivas thread will work just fine on this also. And if you want to go further into that, read that thread article. It'll kind of work that through. But I'm going to start this red thread just up behind that second bead. And I'll run a thread base back to the bend of the hook. Did any of you notice that I'm tying left-handed? I'm actually right-handed. I've always been right-handed. Since I was born, I was right-handed. My first vice when I was a kid had a wing nut on this side, and that's why I tie left-handed. But, do you see, I think you can see it pretty well, see how flat that thread lays? So as I tie left-handed, I unwind the factory twist in the thread and make the thread flat. If you tie right-handed, you have to, and you know this if you tie right-handed, you have to manage your thread a lot more. You have to spin your bobbin to twist or untwist. But that's one of the reasons I can make even like 8/0 unithread, which is pretty corded. I can make it flat by tying left-handed. You could too if you tie left-handed. I don't recommend switching if you tie for a long time right-handed. Don't switch. I have guys every year in class do it. You know, they tie for a couple of years and they'll switch and tie left-handed, and it's astonishing to me. It just blows my mind that they're able to do it. But so for the tail on this, I'm going to use a CDL Coq de Leon hen feather. Put that up there. So what this is just a hen saddle feather. What a CDL hen is a much bigger bird, and you can see it's got really nice modeling on it. You know, an India hen is very, and that's what an India hen is what I used before these came out. The advantage of the CDL hen is it's a much bigger bird, so it's a saddle, and this one's been picked through. It was about 3 times the size of an India hen. The modeling is better, but the biggest part is those fibers, the feather itself is much bigger. It's much longer fibers. You know, so I should put an India hen in my package. An India hen's fibers are 1/3 this length, which just doesn't give you as much butt end to work with. It's harder to manage. So that's the big advantage of these. I do like the modeling, but really the length of the feather is what I like. So what I'll do here to prep this is I'm just going to pull all the fluff on the bottom, and I just thumbnail it off and throw that over there for somebody else to vacuum up. All right, so I've got this hen feather. And for the tail, and I'll try to show you as many little tricks like this. We'll get pretty detailed, but for the tail, can I turn this a little bit? No, that's going to turn your camera, isn't it?
We can adjust it. No, the camera's behind you. That's just.
Oh, okay. All
We're
right,
good there.
sorry. All right. Just so I can see whether I'm on the screen. All right. So if I pull those fibers out at a right angle to the stem, see how the tips have become square here? That's how you square those up. If I cut those straight off of there, see how they're jagged? That actually shows them really well. So to square a tail up or a set of legs, pull them out. It's not always exactly a right angle, but at about a right angle. And then I'll grab that clump, and instead of thinking of pulling this bunch away, I'm going to pull the feather away. So this hand never moved. So I didn't disrupt those. This is something I see in the, you know, we were just talking about watching fly tying videos. I see in a lot of videos is guys get that all nice and neat and even, and then peel it off and tie it on, and it's not even anymore. That's one of the big things in fly tying is being able to get a material from point A to point B without messing it up. A stacked bunch of hair, an even clump of tail fibers. You want to try to keep everything where it stays square, even when you switch hands. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take that and measure that about a half shank long, and I'll do this up here where you can see it. So the way I do this measurement is I'll come in, here I'm going to exaggerate this a bit. I think that's a bad angle for what I'm trying to show you. People ask me this all the time. How do you hold something up to the hook and you just have it exactly the right length when you put it up there? The way I do that is, see how my fingers are open and I can close them and draw this down the length? So right there is the shank length. And then I can change hands with it, and I can do the same thing the other way. This isn't going to be as good an angle. But I can take this and pinch it there at that same point. So that's how I get that measurement. It's not exactly the right length. It's just a matter of, it's close, then I can kind of roll my fingers to that point. So then I'm going to tie this tail in at the bend, and I do that with what's called a D-wrap. So a D-wrap, if I keep this thread tight and push it right over the top, that's going to jump over the far side. A D-wrap, I'm exaggerating that, but I'm going to lose tension as I come over the top, and then I'll tighten the thread toward me. So that was sort of an exaggerated move. That's what it looks in real life. The tail's still a little long. So about a shank length long on the tail. Did you see that one strand catch the hook point? No?
Happens to me all the time.
I was going to say, good, if you didn't see it. I shouldn't have even mentioned it. Then I'll cut those butt ends off. Now, on this fly, we're going to use black thread for the rib, and I am going to use 14-aught Beavis on this one. Curly end here. And I'll take this piece of thread and just lay it against the hook, and I'll catch it the same way. draw it down to length. So that black thread is going to become my rib, and then once I'm done ribbing the fly, I'll just drape that on my vise. Once I'm done ribbing the fly, that'll become my tying thread. So I'm just using the red thread to build the abdomen. And in the case of a 14, I'll just run back and forth a couple times, a little bit of a taper. One thing you want to do on a 2-bit hooker that's a little counterintuitive is you kind of want to jam right up to the back of the bead. Don't leave yourself room. If you leave yourself too much room, it extends the thorax. There's a big hole in the back of that bead and it'll overlap the abdomen. So if you try to leave yourself too much room, that'll become an issue. But also don't jam it up where there's no room between the beads. So if I bump this thread back just a bit here, see how those beads will still move? There's still a little space between them. Just a tiny bit. And then I can whip finish my red thread. I'll nip that out of there. Now I'll pick up my black thread, and typically I'll spin my bobbin. One thing that if you've got your hook hanging straight down, a lot of times when you do this, you'll either hit your hook point with your thread or it'll get caught inside your jaws of your vise and it'll fray the thread. The way to get around that is turn the hook just a little bit and then spin it, and it's not hanging in that spot. And then I can use that thread to rib and just 3 or 4 turns forward. And that's going to create our rib. Does that show for you guys? Yeah. All right, so now for the wing case, this is Opal Mirage tinsel. Medium size is what I use on all of them, honestly, 14, 16s, and 18s. And this spool doesn't have an end. I guarantee it had an end at some point. There it is. Oh. So I'm going to take a piece of this. I've got way more than I need. And when I tie this in, I'm going to tie it in. See how this came off the spool and it's curled up? Does it show? Let's get some dark background. See how it's curled? I'm always going to tie it in that way, curl down. I don't want to tie it in, curl up. If I tie it in this way, with the curl up, that piece is now in the way for the rest of the fly. If I take that and turn it over, now it's curled down and out of my way. That actually might be okay. That might be okay.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, I've got better contrast there. I'll tell you if I can't see. I'll just stop. All right, so now for the thorax, just a little bit of mahogany brown superfine dubbing. Need more light than that.
He needs to be able to see.
And I'm going to put this on very thin and very tight. And one of the reasons for that is I want to put that on the screen there. I want to keep that strand thin, and just barely thicker than the thread, because I've got a fair amount of thread work to do here. So I'm going to wrap this thread up to the dubbing, right up behind that first bead, and I'm going to build a ball about the same size as the bead. Now see, I've still got some dubbing left on the thread there. Then I'm going to jump my thread between the 2 beads, and I'm going to jam that dubbing in between the 2 and kind of fill that void. When I was first coming up with this fly, that second batch of dubbing between the beads didn't make its way there right away. And trying to get the legs set in, because you've got that void in between the 2 beads, your legs would stick straight out to the sides and they'd roll around. There was no pinch wrap or anything that you could do because you weren't touching the hook. By filling that with a little bit of dubbing, that's going to give us a much more even platform to set these in. Now for the legs, there's a couple ways to do these. And I'll show you what I do, and then I'll show you what you'll probably do. So what I typically do, we'll take a clump, square the tips up, just like we did for the tail, twice as big as what we used for the tail. And I'll just use my scissor tips to divide that about in half. Like so. See what I did there? I'm going to lay this in on the hook, and I want the tips about even with the hook point, but I'm going to tilt this just slightly toward me. You guys, so that square there, I'm going to tilt it just slightly toward me, and then I'll pinch those in place and come over that with a turn of thread. Okay.
Wow.
Now they're still off center, but as I tighten the thread, I can push those to square. Get that end out of the way you can see. Those are on the sides of the fly. So what I'm doing there is not fighting with thread torque, which is what 92% of fly tying is fighting with thread torque. What I did is I let the thread torque twist those into position rather than out of position. If I put them on the hook square and tightened them down, the near side would be high, the far side would be low. So I started with the near side low and the far side high and pushed them both into position. That being said, if you can't do that, you're totally okay to take one clump to tie it in on one side and one clump to tie it on the other side. Just don't make 8 turns on each one of those. Put a turn or 2 and then do the other side. You just don't have the room between those beads to jam a lot of wraps in there. So now I'll come in and I just kind of roll these tips up and I'll trim those off flush. One thing I want you to also note that when I tie something down, I very rarely do it with 7 or 8 turns of thread. It's got to be something that's pretty hard to take that many wraps of thread. A soft feather fiber like this, especially over a dubbed body, it's not going to take much to anchor it down. So it's just conservation of turns. It's not like I'm trying to save thread. I'm just trying not to pile a bunch of it on the hook. So now I'll pick up my wing case and I'll square it up on the hook. You guys have a pretty good angle on that. Get a couple turns on it, and then I always, with the flashback, I'll always fold that back and catch it with a couple more turns. The reason I do that is back in the day I used to tie 8 billion flashback pheasant tails every winter. And if you didn't do that, you'd fish a pheasant tail for about 15 minutes and it'd have a little emerger wing. The flash would come out. So if you fold it back in, it won't come out near as easily. This fly ultimately will have some resin on top of it, so not as big an issue, but old habits die hard. So then I just whip finish between those 2 beads. I'll nick that thread out. Here's a good habit to get into too when you trim your thread. Rather than come in and snip your thread, just open your scissors a bit and you can just push it up against the thread. And what that'll do is it'll only cut what's tight. On a fly like this, there's not a lot of stuff sticking out. But if you tied like an Adams or a Humpy, where you've got a lot of hackle there, if you go in and snip, you're probably not only going to snip the thing you intended to, but something else also. In that case, just pushing the blade against it, it only cuts what you're pulling tight. So good habit to get into so you don't fight with something for half an hour and then cut it off. I'm going to try to get you an angle on this. So on this flash, the other thing I do is I'll come in, I don't have quite enough light to do this, but just nick the edge, and then I'll tear the flash off so that it goes right down flat against that thread. If you were perhaps like a fly tyer guy who wrote books and had a picture of a bunch of these on the back of one of your fly tying books, and we're trying to figure out where the big dimple in the epoxy came from, it's that little tag end of the tinsel that sticks up, which is 82% less effective than if it's not there. So make sure that's not there. Those macro cameras show you lots of stuff that you think you're really good until you take a picture that's 14 inches across and you see all the little details. So now I'm going to put some resin on this. And there's a lot of different resins in the world. I like Solarez. This is Solarez Medium. You can use Solarez Bone Dry Plus also. It's pretty close to the same consistency, honestly. I use more and more of this. This stuff doesn't smell as bad as all the rest of them. I don't like Loon. Loon doesn't seem to adhere very well. This stuff sticks very well. So I'm just going to take a little drop of this. It's more than I need. But I'm going to sweep these legs down, and I'm going to put it right down on the back of the front bead, over the top of that wing case. And you can see how I kind of bounce the needle. And I'll go all the way down to the tail and then sweep forward. And what I ultimately want here is kind of a teardrop shape, just to smooth out the taper of that fly. And then I'll hit him with my UV lamp. Now one thing when you hit it with your UV lamp, see how far away my lamp is? And I'm kind of on and off with it. This is already dry, I'm just illustrating now. You see in all the videos, and me included, everybody did this for a long time. The catch with that is it cures it too fast and it doesn't get all the way through. It makes it too hard too fast. If you cure from further away and kind of on and off with the light, it lets that resin cure all the way through, and it's not so, it adheres much better. If you bake it all in one spot, do it, put a drop on your desk and do it, and you'll see how much better it adheres if you cure from far away. The guy that actually makes Solarez is made to repair surfboards. It's been around for 30 years. I was watching a video of the guy that invented it doing a surfboard, and he would take the light from behind his head and shine it on and off, shine it on and off. And I asked him at one of the trade shows why that is, and that's why. And it really does make a difference. It makes a difference in how well it sticks. If you've had resin flies or epoxy flies, copper johns, things like that in your box that you go to pull out with your forceps and the epoxy pops off, it's because you cured it too close. It's hard, but it's not stuck. And that's one of the things I like about Solar-Res over the other stuff, is it adheres to the fly a lot better.
Question.
Yes, sir.
In the Texas sun, if we were guilty of what you were just saying, and we put a fly out and let it just sit there in the sun, would the sun penetrate?
Yeah, the sun cures it pretty well. That's the other thing that Gary Fisher is the guy that owns Solar-Res. He said, like, when they do a big application on a surfboard, they just roll it outside in the yard. So yes, the sun is fine because it's not so concentrated like that lamp. And I just charged the battery. You saw how bright that was. I just charged the battery on this. It's super bright. But yeah, if you're doing a batch of flies and you put them out in the sun, that's fine too, because it's not as concentrated as the single lamp would be. This lamp actually, when it's brand new, I can actually feel the light come out of it. It's not hot, but you can feel it. Like it's definitely there. So let me put this in a clip and I'll let you guys hand that around. And you can.
Are you trying to match a particular mayfly?
The ones that the fish are eating. No, not a particular mayfly. A general mayfly profile. So not specifically. You know, I do have a 2-bit green drag. I have a 2-bit. I've used the 2-bit thing in a bunch of different bugs, but 2-bit hooker is just a generic mayfly nymph. And I've tied it. You know, I tie it in brown, red, dark olive, light olive, purple, pink. I think that's all of them. I think that's all the commercial colors. Brown was the first one, you know, kind of pheasant tail is what I was thinking. Red has become my, black's the other one. Red has become my favorite. I fish a size 14 red almost all summer long. I feel like I have a Charlie Boy hopper, a 2-bit hooker, and a Jujubatus on 92% of the time when I fish, and I try not to do that just because I already know they work. But if I go 4 or 5 minutes without catching a fish, I immediately revert back to it. You know, I try to act like I'm not greedy, but I like to have them pull on the other end. But yeah, size 14 red and size 18 black are probably the two I fish the most. And the reason I say that is my box. I've got all the colors and all the sizes in my box, and I feel like I am retying those two more often than I am everything else. There's a hot pink one. That hot pink one can be really good in dirty water. The dark olive is the best seller. You know, that's just a bug color, I guess. You know, when shops order flies, they see dark olive and think blueing olive. For the record, a bluing olive nymph is not olive; it's brown, but pays the same. So, any questions on that one? Oh, only a half hour for that one. We'll be here for 3.5 hours. All right. All right. So this next one, this is sort of the debut. I've shown this fly one other time in public, and this just you just told me you got it in the magazine. So it just came out in Fly Fisherman magazine. I've been saving it until it came out in the magazine, so that was ideal that it just came out. This one's called a Lucky Bee, and this is a pattern that I have worked on and off, I'm not even kidding, for 30 years. And by worked on, I mean the idea of the pattern. So back in the day, I was a guide in Cheeseman Canyon. And every day I'd pump a fish. I didn't pump every fish, but I'd pump a fish every day just to kind of see, anything new. If it was the same bugs as yesterday, nothing was changing. But every now and again, you'd go from beta nymphs to PMD nymphs, or and it was just sort of research. But every day during the summer, I'd pump fish that would have a yellow jacket in them, a yellow jacket, a hornet. And since then, I was 22 years old then. Since then, I've been thinking, like, those fish obviously eat those things. Like I should come up with a pattern for a yellow jacket. I played with, I've got 20 different iterations of it, all of which suck. So if you guys would like to see those sometime, maybe you can have me back. We can just do like 3 hours of bee patterns. But I finally came up with one that doesn't suck. And that's the one I'll show you now. And it's got a sister pattern that I'll tie tomorrow that is a mud dauber pattern, which is the same fly in black. And I fished both of these for the first time a couple years ago on a trip to Idaho. The first set of prototypes I brought with me on a trip to Idaho. And Hot July day, middle of the day, where things have, mornings are usually really good, afternoon, evenings are usually good, middle of the day is usually terrible. You drag a few fish out on nymphs. And I put the mud dauber on, I put the yellow jacket on my wife's rod, and we fished our way down. And it was astonishing how many fish, do you know how fish eat a beetle with 100% confidence? Like, fish don't eyeball a beetle, they know what it is, they eat it slowly because they know it can't get away. That's how they eat this fly. It is a fly that they recognize. It pulls fish up from a long way away. It seems like it's, for right now, because I don't think a lot of people are fishing them, it's pretty safe to the fish. And it's really a fun fly to fish because you see fish come out and they know they're safe. They're just almost cocky about it, which is awesome. That's my favorite thing is to fool them. So I'm glad that I finally came up with one to do that. And I'm going to dig all these pieces out of this giant bag and show it to you. And it's a little kind of artsy crafty fly, which probably doesn't speak to anyone in this room because fly tyers are never like that.
What river in Idaho?
I knew somebody was going to ask. That was on the Teton. This year I actually fished it on the South Fork also, and they ate it there too. I have fished this fly. Since then I fished this fly on small creeks. I fish it, I was just going to say on the Platte, like all you guys fish on the Platte. You guys aren't from Denver. The Platte, which is a weird spot. It's the tiny technical tailwater kind of stuff. And my son and I were up there fishing, and my son was fishing a run, then fishing a run, and I had a bee on my patch, and I tied it on and just started fishing it. And I caught fish, and all you got to do is just put it where you think there ought to be a fish and get a good drift with it, and they'll eat it. It's a bug that fish see, and the whole idea came from the Platte, so it shouldn't surprise me so much that it worked there, but it really is a fly that people think is for the angler, and was definitely proven to be for the fish. So we've got a couple little steps here. I'm not as blind as it seems, it's just a little dark. So we're going to start.
Would you like another layback?
No, I think I'm all right once I get up in the visor. If I break my thread or do something ugly, I'll blame it on you. All right, so I'm going to start with the needle. This is just a regular sewing needle, fairly small diameter. And the first thing I'm going to do is take my thread and start it here. I've got the pointy end out, and I'm going to go about 9 millimeters. And the reason I know it's 9 millimeters is I just had to write the directions for it and I measured it. And I bet that if you came and measured that, that's 9 millimeters. It's amazing how quickly, as a fly tyer, I am amazed by it all the time, how quickly your eye measures things exactly the same. And I think in my case that comes from commercial tying back in the day where I just did the same thing over and over again. But I'll say I'm going to grab 12 strands of pheasant tail for a tail on a fly, and I count them in a demo, and there's 12. So trust yourself. You're probably better at it than you think you are. You start to just kind of get that spatial relationship built into you. Oh, you know what I didn't do? Hang on, if I don't put this stuff back in this bag for tomorrow sure is going to be terrible. All right. So once I've got that on there, I'm going to take a piece of polyarn. This is McFlylon. It doesn't have to be McFlylon. Doesn't have to be polyarn really, but I'm just going to take a little bit of it, just a little strand. And I'm going to tie this down on top of that needle, all the way down that same 9 millimeters. And I'll trim the front end off. I usually leave the back end long for right now. So that was just, out of a whole strand, it was just a little bit. We're going to end up sliding this obviously off this needle, and that is to facilitate that. If you don't do that, sometimes it'll come off, but if you're doing a demo in front of about maybe like 50 people, I guarantee it won't come off. It'll adhere like no tomorrow to that thing. So now for the abdomen, I've got a piece of 3 millimeter foam here. So this is 3 millimeters thick. Go that way. So this is a sheet of foam. I'll show you where this came from. So, a sheet of 3mm foam. And I just sliced off the edge, about 1 millimeter thick. I'm going to take this piece of foam, I'm going to tie it down at the front here, and just spiral wrap back over it, right up to the end of that thread base. And I'm not taking it easy on the thread tension there. Everybody thinks because you're tying on a needle you want to make it a little loose so that you can pull it off. I'm not taking it easy, I'm tying it down tightly. And then I'm going to take a piece of 0x tippet material, and I'm going to tie this in with a long end sticking out the front. And I'll wrap back almost short of just short of the end of the body, and then fold it forward and tie it down again. So I've got 2 strands of mono coming out the front end there. I'm going to shorten those just a bit. Now I'm going to take some super glue. Oh, I was afraid of this. Don't look, Mom. Oh,
You bought that one.
I know. You know what this is? This is Texas humidity.
We don't know what that is.
In Colorado, you can leave your super glue open, it doesn't dry. Come on. Well, I'm about going to have to. So, you guys seen any good football games lately? This is on there. Ah, teeth work every time, Mom. Come on. All right, so I'm going to take just a little drop. And I want to smear it on there. And then I'll use my bodkin to kind of get top and bottom. And really the big thing on this is it's really easy to overdo that. And you don't want to hesitate too long. But now I'm going to take this piece of foam and I'm going to lay it on edge and begin to wrap it. And I'm going to overlap these turns. Think of wrapping a biot to create this segmented body. Fairly square on the front end. And then I'll bring that foam up and tie it off on top of itself. So I've got a fairly square front edge there. Then I'm going to come in with my scissors and get right down close and trim that off. And sometimes you got to do a little cleanup to smooth that off. So that's our abdomen. Now when I whip finish this, I'll just do this by hand. If you've got a big whip finisher, you can reach over those 2 strands of mono. Now, without delay, I'm going to grab this and twist it and pull it off the hook. Now once I've got this off of here, I'm going to take this needle out so I don't stab myself. I'm going to pull that tag end of thread here out of the way, and I'll trim that yarn off flush. And this is a wintertime thing that's been bugging me. This is what keeps me up at night. I think I should leave that piece of yarn in there and I should make it blackfish stinger. But then I wake up and say, that's dumb, I don't need that. But that's been heavy on my mind. So now this tag end right here, see the tag that's coming out? You guys see it? I'm going to pull on that. See that? Pull that slack out? And that'll tighten up at some point. There we go. I pull some of that yarn out, and I can trim that tag out. So what I just did is pulled that tight from the inside. So think of a nail knot, like you tie your leader to your fly line. It's the tag end underneath everything. You're just pulling the other end of it tight. This we just took the slack out. So now I'll set this aside, and oh, geez. There's 2. Get them separated here. 2 strands of mono there. Usually one of them straighter than the other. I'll cut off the one that's not as straight. So I've just got a single strand. And typically I'll go through and do a bunch of those ahead of time. So set that aside. Now, I'm going to grab a Tiemco 2487. Magic?
Yeah.
What that is 30 years of other flies. You know, it's amazing how, I mean, these days I'm 50, how old am I? I'm 51 years old. I've tied since I was 8, and when I was a kid I used to just tie, I tied commercially, so I got a chance to tie a lot of weird stuff that you never thought would transfer over to anything until now at 50 years old. I find myself using a lot of techniques from old flies, like that extended body thing. I used to do that on paradrake patterns that I used to tie for West Bank anglers in like 1984. That tag end would tighten the hair down from the inside, so you could actually tighten the end down. And it was just, you know, a thing that I came across. It wasn't like I invented it. It's just like, hey, if I pull on that end, what happens? That's what happens.
So when you said tagging, you're talking about
The loose end of the thread.
the thread, okay.
Yep. So now I've got, this is a 2487 size 16, and I've tied these in 14s and 16s. 14s are oversized. They're much bigger than a real yellow jacket. Fish still seem to like those. That's what I fished on the South Fork, kind of an oversized version. But the 16 is about the real size. And luckily, I'm sure you guys have yellow jackets here, yeah? Yeah, okay. I was going to say, if you don't, maybe I'll move you. I have yellow jackets in every nook and cranny around my house that they could possibly exist in. They're everywhere. So when I was coming up with this fly, you'll see when we color it, I actually had a little model sitting around on my desk that makes it pretty fun.
We have them in size 8s.
You have big ones. Oh, you have magnums. All right, well. All right, so I'm going to wrap this thread, same thread, just back to about the hook point. And I'm going to take my tag end of this mono. Now, one thing that I'll do, try to get this up here where you can see it, is I'll very often take this body and kind of pinch it between, see how I'm curling it? Just to give it a little arch, like so. And I'll tie that mono down. And the mono is what's going to give us this perfect little wasp waist in this fly. So it's not a chunky, you know, not a consistent body. It's going to give us a tiny little waist. I'm going to tie that mono down, and I'll wrap up to just short of the eye, and then I'm going to fold this mono back. Now, one thing I see people do when they're trying to do this, anytime, like even on an articulated fly, if I fold this mono back and try to wrap over it, it's stiff, so it pushes my thread off. The way to catch that is to back your thread up and catch it further back. And the reason I made that loop in there is the first few I tied, I didn't do that. So you go to pull the fly out of the fish and you pull the body off the end of the mono. The mono will come out from underneath there. So fold that down. And then I'm going to take another piece of foam that's about 3 by 2. So just slightly thicker. And those measurements, I know the 3 part is right because that's what it comes from the factory. But the 1 and 2 is me with a razor blade, so there's a little slack there. So I want to cut a square end on this. You can see this is a little thicker than what we started with. Oh, not yet. We're going to put some legs in. So these are Montana Fly sexy legs, and this is small size. And these are amber, I believe, yeah. One of the things, so this is amber, and they're barred. The amber, the orange, and the yellow, to my eyeball, look like the same color. They're listed as different colors, but any of those that you've got will be fine. And I'm going to tie this strand in kind of at the middle of its length. I'm going to catch it on the far side and wrap back over it here, just to where I started. And then I'll pull this front end back on my near side, and that's going to make our back dangly legs back there. Now I'll take that 2 by 3 piece of foam, and I'm going to put another shot of super glue. I brought this big bottle of glue because the lid usually comes off it really easily, instead of my little Zap-A-Gaps. I put down a little shot of glue, and then I'll tie down this strip of foam just behind the hook eye and wrap back over it right up to the base of the legs.
Charlie, do you ever make kind of an arrow, a point out of your foam before you tie it in?
In few cases. Foam is pretty compressible, but the catch with making a tapered end, it is easy to catch. But what you end up with is an uneven underbody. You know, I wrote an article years ago called Beauty from Within. And the fly has to be pretty on the inside to be pretty on the outside, to be even and consistent on the outside. The underbody has got to be even and consistent. So if you've got a tapered piece, it's much skinnier at the front and then fatter at the back. And because you have to think your hook shank is the center. So if you tie something on top of the hook, all that bulk is only on one side. So if it's skinny at one end and fat at the other, even putting dubbing on that, you're never going to get that even again, because now the dubbing is going around the hook and the bulk was only on one side of the hook. So I very rarely cut to a point. There are a few instances, but not very many. You can see how that is. You guys don't have a great angle on that, maybe that angle. See how that's very square? That's going to give you a nice, even, consistent underbody shape for this thorax. So now I'm going to take a little pinch of black dubbing.
Will warm water species eat that?
I cannot imagine that they wouldn't. It's a pretty rubber leggy bug. And every warm water species I've ever encountered likes terrestrial stuff, so I would say for sure. So I'm going to take just a little bit of black superfine here. And I want to put this on, again, really tightly. I like superfine because I can dub it down so tightly. And that gives me a lot of ability to shape and form this ball of dubbing. So I'm going to make a ball here. And then for the wing, I'm going to use the most buoyant material I've ever used. And what this is, let me get a bigger clump. This is polypropylene macrame yarn. So this is, a craft store item. We do sell it at the shop because people ask for it. Well, I thought I had a piece of it. It comes in a rope. It's in a big coil. And what this is, if I hold that up, is mixed colors. Yellow, gray, rust, black. I think that's all of them in that one. And I use a finger brush, like a dog brush, a wire dog brush, to brush that out. And I'll brush out a strand of each color, get it completely brushed out, and then I just start literally doing this. I'll pull it out, and I'll stack it back on top of it. I just sit there and I do that during Bronco games, which there's been plenty of time to do that lately. So that's how I get the mixed colors. And what I end up with is a pretty speckled mix. So I want to take a clump of this, and you don't need near as much as you think. One, because we're going to double it, and two, the advantage of this stuff over regular poly yarn is A, it's shiny, so it's heat treated, but B, because it's woven into that rope to start with, it's got a lot more curl to it when you brush it out, so it has a lot more surface area. This is what I use for wings on parachutes, chubbies, anything that's got a poly yarn wing. I use this macrame yarn now. It is absolutely the most buoyant material I've ever used. So I'm going to take this piece and I'm going to sort of furl it, kind of roll the ends in opposite directions, and then fold it over, make a loop, like so. And then I'm going to roll that into a tight little V, like so. And I'm going to take this and lay it in kind of across the top of the fly. And I'll trim that butt end out. I'm going to put that in for my far wing, kind of angled up and across the far side. I'll take that same clump and do that again. So the video for this is on Fly Fisherman's webpage right now. That just occurred to me. So if they've got it in the magazine, it'll be on their webpage. It'll be on our webpage shortly, but I'll let them have first shot on it. So one wing on each side. And I like those wings kind of widespread and fairly, you're not getting a great angle. I'm going to prop them up a little bit here as we go. Then I'm going to take another strand of this sexy leg. I'm going to tie it in right at the base of the wing here, along the near side, and one in along the far side. Now, kind of the same thing we just talked about, the legs on the two-bit hooker. Can you guys see how I've got this a little high if I get my head out of the way? As I wrap over it, my thread will drag it down to the far side. So if I put it right where I want it, my thread's going to pull it low. I want to set it a little high and let my thread pull it into position. You can see that band of thread right here. That's to separate those legs. If you make a narrow band, you'll get a real tight X. If you make a wider band, they'll kind of front and back like that. And you can kind of tweak things into position. And another little pinch of superfine dubbing. It's a good thing this table's light colored. All right, now before I wrap this though, I want to put just a little drop. I use a lot of glue when I tie with foam. Foam and glue go together really well, but just a little drop of glue right on top of the base of that wing, and I'll wrap the dubbing over it. So I'm going to wrap between the legs. I can kind of even X around these legs. And then as I run out of dubbing, I'm going to be, you can see I've got about an eye length worth of bare space behind the hook eye there. Now I'm going to bring my foam up between the two wings. Tie it down right behind the hook eye with a couple of turns. And then I'm going to take this front end and fold it and catch it again. So then I'm going to come in and I'm just going to whip finish. Yeah, it looks like a bee, doesn't it? I'm going to whip finish right through that crease. And I do whip finish before I cut that end. I leave this end long. If you don't do that when you go to whip finish, you'll try to kind of catch that end. So that now I'll come in and I can trim this off flush. See this leg right here? See how it's kind of wonky? What happened there is that some of that glue got on that leg. If you get glue on those kind of rubber legs, they get kind of screwy. You can try taking it and working it back and forth. Yeah, there we go. What I did is just slid it underneath the thread wrap. If you stretch it, it'll make it smaller diameter. You can kind of position it a little better. So now I'm going to trim these legs. I like to leave them fairly long, but all about the same. These back legs I leave real long. This is that thing on your picnic table with those dangly legs. Then I'm going to take both of these wings, and because that glue is still wet in there, I'm going to pinch everything upright. So those wings stand up. That really does make the fly a lot easier to see. Here, to give you a good view there. And now we get to the fun part. So this is the coloring part. And honestly, I think you could probably not color this, but why wouldn't you? So I'm going to use, this is a Copic marker, and it's got a watercolor tip. It's got this real fine tip. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to draw a line down the center of the abdomen. And you can see I'm just very, very lightly doing that. Then I'll draw some stripes down the side. And then I kind of fill in, there's a little triangle on their back. And it depends on if you're imitating a paper wasp or just depends on what kind of bug you want to imitate. The ones on my deck apparently are paper wasps. And then a couple little spots down each side. It's starting to look pretty familiar now, isn't he? And then up here, I'm just going to kind of do some chevrons down the sides. One line down the center.
Tilt your head the other way, John.
Oh, sorry. An eye on each side. Chevron down the head. And then one thing, yeah, I'll give you this angle. This is actually where the eyes are on them, so I kind of make that ugly little yellow jacket face, like that. Fill it in a little here.
You don't put the antenna in?
I don't think the antennae are important. So that is the lucky bee. Get it positioned a little better for you to see. But
Charlie, what was the wing material again? Just macrame fiber?
polypropylene macrame yarn.
Thank you.
You got it. I didn't know that talked. So that's him. And like I say, there's a mud dauber version that's all black that has the best fly name on the history of the planet. Good for the guy that I was fishing with in Idaho. We were throwing that mud dauber, and I said, God, I need a name. I said, I think I'll call that the Lucky Bee, but I don't know what I'm going to call this one. And he said, well, you're going to call it Jeffrey Dauber. And I did. Best name yet. So that's Lucky B.
Do you slap that down like a hopper or?
I have done a bunch, you know, we fished a couple of small little creeks up in Wyoming this last year. And like if you smacked it down like, you know, the wind was blowing, fish it like a hopper. You know, like a hopper or a beetle. You know, if you're in real long glassy stuff, one thing I found, and I found on this, but it's true of a beetle also. You know, make a long cast and get a good drift with it. You know, you think of a hopper like you're going to smack it down, the fish is going to come right up and eat it, which sometimes happens. But I find that if you just fish a good long drag-free drift with anything, you got a lot better chance than trying to get an impulse take out of them. So I just make a long cast of start at the inside of the, you know, on a bend. Always fish the inside, and it's amazing how many times, like I put it up really shallow on the inside, and you'd see a fish come out of the deep water, come over to eat it. Like they knew what was up, you know, like they knew that kind of thing happened. So they very much eat it like a beetle, but I usually just try to get a long drift with it. You know, that day on the Teton, we're fishing from the boat, so you get a really long drift with it. But you know, we'd come down into some of those spots where, you know, big rocks in the bottom, it's 10 feet deep, and you'd see fish come up and look at it and like circle down where they could intercept it, like they knew it couldn't get away. So you know, it's an extraterrestrial pattern. It's not the be-all, the end-all by any means, but you know, if you're throwing a hopper, you're throwing a beetle, it's another terrestrial pattern that you can throw. And just because it's different, it's been a lot more fun than you know, I've fished hoppers for years and beetles for maybe even longer than that, because you know, those were easier to tie. This is a fly that I haven't got to fish as much as that kind of stuff, so it's a lot more interesting to me, and it's, you know, it's fooling the fish. That's the cool part of it. That's the thing that was the most fun about it is, you know, coming up with it during the winter and then saying like, I think that's the one, and then taking it out and like, yeah, that's the one. But that little waist, I think, is what does it. The silhouette is just
That's
right.
a beautiful fly.
You dress that in tan?
No, you can do it in any color. In any color. Give you a little better idea what you're looking at there. All right, so let's pass that one around.
Charlie, you said you do the mud dauber version. Is
Yep.
it the same thing, just different color?
Same thing, just black. Everything except the wing is black. And the wing is the same. Oh, wrong bag. Wrong bag. Questions on that one?
When you look your macrame,
Uh-huh.
which I've always found it holds its shape better than if it was just a plot cut in.
Right.
You ever do that for a parachute post?
So I have. I'm actually working on a little emerger pattern that has a wing that's looped like that. The advantage of that loop is you got a lot of surface area. You know, that's what makes your fly float. The catch to it is you've got to tie down both ends of that, so you end up with a lot of bulk. You know, on a parachute, I like the X-wrap to tie the wing in because there's no bulk. So it's not to say that you couldn't do that. You know, if you've got a big enough fly to have room for the bulk of the tie down, absolutely. You know, one thing I did notice fishing it this last year, we're fishing this little creek in the Browns, and it all had pretty good teeth. You know, it was during summer, it wasn't spawning season, they just had good teeth, but those loop wings would stick in their teeth. I am sure some of those fish weren't hooked. You know, their teeth were just tangled in it. You know, we'd get them in the net, and the fly would be just hanging by their teeth. So, you know, and that's why the super glue's there. The other thing too, I will tell you, you know, pinch your barbs on those when you tie a bunch of them and put them in your box. Because if you put a bunch in the box together, the barb from one will go through the wing of the other, and you'll spend half an hour trying to untangle it. So pinch the barb before you put them in your box. Then your wife yells at you while you haven't tied the fly on yet. Gotta make up some story. All right, other than our little super glue fiasco, we did pretty good there. What's next on our list? I guess I don't have to do them in this order. Do you guys want to see a Fat Angie, a Swim Coach, a Drunken Susie, or a Humpy?
Yeah, sure.
Yes.
Yes.
It's my kind of crowd. Well, then we'll just go in order. Fat Angie is like I said, all the flies have a story for their name. And this fly is named after my little sister, who is not fat and not named Angie. But, so my mom is the youngest of 5 brothers and sisters. And my sister is the youngest of 5 brothers and sisters. And so, I'm going to say 30 years ago, we were at my grandmother's house, who was, fairly old at the time. And, old women get a little salty and mean as they age. And, yeah. And one day we were all of us cousins, I don't even know how many of us there were, there's 50 of us all between a bunch of us. But my youngest sister was maybe 12, 13, 14. And she was the youngest grandchild out of 50 of them. My grandmother just couldn't remember her name. She always called her something different. She used to call her Angie. Her name is Andrea. My sister's name is Andrea. So she used to call her Angie, which we all thought was super funny. And then one day we were all standing, and in front of everybody, my grandmother puts her arm around her and she says, "Angie, you're getting kind of fat." Yeah, which is exactly, I have 4 sisters, so my other 3 sisters and I were immediately like, "Yeah, Fat Angie." So we've always called her Fat Angie. And when I came up with this slide, it's got kind of a big butt, and I named it Fat Angie after my sister.
So your sister talk to you still?
She not as much, weirdly.
Can't imagine why.
Everybody wants a fly named after them until they get a fly named after them. My sister-in-law, I got that one coming too, so my sister-in-law was all about getting a fly named after her. She got it all right, so. All right, so this one, this fly is available for monk. It came through last year, and this has been a pretty big hit. I've been fishing this for 5 or 6 years now, and it's a foam attractor pattern. And the idea, honestly, at first was a little ant pattern, a little terrestrial pattern, which then sort of branched out into different sizes and colors and configurations. But it's sort of my answer to a Chevy Chernobyl. Especially in big size. I'm going to tell you, I think this is a 12. I'm going to tell you a size 12, so this is kind of a medium-sized one. But there's a big Fat Angie and a Fat Angie. Big Fat Angie is the full-size bug with 2 wings and 2 sets of legs. A Fat Angie is one set of wings and 1 set of legs. But I'll walk you through the Fat Angie here. So this is a Daiichi 1167, which is a black clinkhammer hook. Okay? And this is a size 12, which is really about a size 8 in anything else in the world. So again, there's no consistency between hook sizes because nobody set the standard in the beginning. So this is a 12, but I'd really call it an 8. And I'm going to take some 14-aught Vivas. I'm going to tie you a tan one, so I'm going to use orange thread. I tie these in lots of colors. Every color that foam comes in, I tie these. But I'm going to start this thread just in front of the hook point here. And I'm going to run a thread base about halfway down that bend and back up again. And then I've got a piece of 3mm foam that's cut, I'm going to say pretty close to 3 by 3. 3 by 2.75, something like that. I'm going to take our glue and I'm going to put, anytime you tie with foam, it's a good idea to put a little shot of glue down on the hook to start. It just sticks, it makes the fly so much more durable. And especially when you're tying with thicker foam, it's hard to get the foam all the way compressed. So while you can finish the fly, a lot of times when you fish it, it'll start to twist on the hook. So I'm going to take this and tie it in just in front of the hook point. And again, to your question earlier about cutting a point, I'm leaving that square so that I can use that foam to build the bulk underneath that I need. So I won't have to use so much dubbing. I'll just spiral back over this, right down to the end of that thread base. And then anchor that down. I'm going to trim that down just a bit because I don't need it all. So now for the butt end, any variety of dubbing will work here. This is trout hunter dubbing, professional dubbing in orange. They don't make this anymore because generally if I find something I like, they stop making it right away. But it really is not anything special. It's just a coarse synthetic dubbing. You can use superfine on the black ones. I use mahogany superfine because I like that color. You'll see we're just going to make a ball. It's not anything special here. So I'm going to take some of this dubbing. And this is a big fly, so I can go a little heavier application. It really is more humid here. Like my hands are generally really dry. Like I can dub like no tomorrow here. My hands have got some texture to them.
Charlie, you don't push the dubbing up to the top of the...
To the thread, or to the hook? I don't. So what Kier's asking about is pulling this up. The catch with that is it invariably makes your dubbing loose. You went through all those machinations to get it adhered to the thread, and then you move it. So I don't. You know, and that's one of the things I like about polyester thread is it grabs dubbing really well. It's got some texture. So Unithread and Vivus are both polyester threads. UTC and Danville are nylon threads. Your dubbing slides a lot easier on nylon thread, so it doesn't adhere as well. So I'm just going to burn that thread up and then start dubbing. And I'm going to build a ball here. So I'm just going to cover everything to start, and then I can kind of tighten this as I go. But see yeah, you guys can see it. See the stub that I left hanging out the front? I'm leaving that there on purpose. And I'll just jump off that front edge. From here, I'm going to run my thread all the way up to the eye and back again. And a little shot of glue right there. The reason I left that foam sticking out right there is it squares off the edge of that abdomen, and I'm about to put some glue on it, so that's going to glue this to this when I fold it over. So again, just makes the fly more durable. So I'm going to pull this piece of foam over the top. I'm going to take a turn over it, tighten the thread toward me, and then anchor it down. Then I usually lift it up and move the thread forward a bit and create a little segment. And in that segment, I'm just going to build a band of thread. So I'm just going to work back and forth here. So your thread color is important because it's going to show, like so. If you're really anal, like I am, see the edges of that right there, how they're square? You can come in with your scissors and knock that edge off. 32% more fish per day. Much better. If you really wanted to get crafty, if you hit that for 1 second with a lighter, it'll round off really nicely. 37% more fish per day.
This is all data driven, I guess.
It is, absolutely, yes. Yeah, I'm a data guy.
Statistical analysis.
Exactly. So now I've got some, this is called Super Floss, Flexi Floss. It's the same stuff you'd make the legs on a Pat's rubber leg, same stuff we made the legs on the bee out of. And I use a lot of this these days instead of rubber legs. This stuff doesn't dry rot like rubber legs does. If you've ever tied a big batch of rubber leg anything and had them in your box for a couple of years, eventually you have a box of flies without rubber legs. And you know, if you buy flies like that for your store, you might eventually have a bin full of just legs left. So I use this a lot more than regular rubber legs these days. And you can see the band of thread I've got. We don't have a great angle right there, but I've got the thread hanging right in the center of it. I guess that's kind of showing for you there. So if that's an inch long, the thread's hanging at the half-inch point. I'm going to take one leg and tie it in here. Nope, I'm not. I'm going to show you this way. I'm going to tie it in here with the long end forward. Catch it. And then I'm going to loop this over and catch it on the far side. From that point, I can kind of tweak the ends and get them adjusted. And then I'm going to pull this all back and tuck that piece of foam through there to hold it out of my way. Okay. I'm going to jump this up. I can pull this foam back forward, and I'm going to tie it down one more time. Bring my thread right up to the hook eye. Oh, geez, you know what? Hold on. I got to talking. Oh, we forgot a wing. Let's put a wing in there. No, I didn't. No, I didn't. I didn't forget the wing.
You want your book?
This one's not in the book yet. That's why I don't know it that well. What I'm getting confused is Fat Angie and Big Fat Angie's. Big Fat Angie has two wings. This one only has one wing. So this is the macrame yarn that we were talking about earlier. So this is how it comes. It comes in a rope like so. And what I'll do with this, get this up where you can see it. That end's kind of frayed already, but this is a finger brush. Hairline sells these. You can see it's like a wire dog brush. And honestly, for a big clump of this, a wire dog brush works much quicker and easier. You know, they're about $10 at the pet store. But I'm going to take that and shred out the end of that yarn. And usually I'll do this on the tabletop. I sit on my granite countertop at home and do this because it slides real easy. But just brush out a clump like so. Oh, I lost our focus.
Can you do a whole length that way?
You can do about 10 inches. If you try to get much longer than that, you get to a point where it's just too tangled on one end. You know, you got to kind of start at the ends and kind of work out from the middle. And you get to a point where it's just too tangled in the middle. You can't get it apart anymore. So, you know, 8 or 10 inches is about max.
So you don't unravel it first, you just...
I just brush it. You know, when I first started doing it, I did unravel it. But it seemed like that was kind of a wasted step. Like if you're working, you know, you're never going to need a whole 8 inches for a fly. But yes, 8 inches or so, you can do that whole clump pretty easily. And you can see, actually one thing that you don't want to do is don't overbrush it. If you brush it too much, you can kind of get all the curl out of it. You can kind of pull on it too much. This one is called Grizzly Bear. It's kind of brown and tan, just sort of bug colored. So I'm going to take a smaller clump of that.
Oh, so those aren't long threads. They're, well, I mean, you just pulled it out. Did you cut it?
Yeah, I cut it. I cut it. Yeah, I cut it off the end of there. Yep. Yeah, yeah, a couple 3 inches. Yep. Just because I'm doing one fly. And honestly, I mean, so that's what I just brushed out of there. You know, one little clump. That's enough for 10 or 12 of these. You know, it goes a long way. Yeah, it's not an expensive material. There, that's the part I wanted to show you on a fat Angie. On a big fat Angie, you got to fold the foam back also. But on a fat Angie, see how I loop that back so those legs are out of the way, so I don't have to fight with them. Now I'm going to tie my wing in, but I want to come all the way up to the hook eye here and tie this foam down one more time. And I'll cross hatch back and forth over that, just to buy myself a little room in between. So now I'm going to take my yarn. And I'm going to take a little bit of blue UV Ripple ice fiber. So this is pretty blue and shiny. And I started doing these on morningwood hoppers and stones. I started putting this as a topping on the wing. And it's amazing, this stuff is really shiny. But it's amazing how much this shows up on the water. It's really mirrored. So like if you're fishing in the sun, it shows up like no tomorrow. In the gray, you still have a little bit of sparkle, but it makes the fly so much more visible. So what I'm going to do is just grab, I don't need a bunch. I'm just going to grab it's a fairly long fiber. I don't know, there's 8 or 10 fibers there maybe. And I'm going to take that and just put it on top of that clump of yarn. So it's just sort of a topping. A little ragged, so I'm going to cut it square here. You can see it's not much, just a little highlight. So now I'm going to take that clump of yarn and right at the base of that foam, I'm going to tie this in with some X-wraps. And I want these fairly widespread. The idea of this macrame yarn is that we're going to use it to create some surface area. The kink of it is going to give us some buoyancy. That's really what makes your fly float. You know, you've all taken a woolly bugger and made, tied it on, made a cast, you throw it way out in the middle of the lake, and it sits on top for the first 5 strips because it hasn't soaked yet. A woolly bugger has a fair amount of surface area. That's what makes a fly float. Even a weighted woolly bugger, short of a conehead, but like with lead inside the body, even a weighted woolly bugger will still float until it gets wetted. And that's what makes your flies float. Floating keeps your flies from getting wet, but surface area is what makes your fly float in the first place, just like boats. So that's what we're trying to do here, is build some surface area. So I'm going to leave those wings spread wide, and then I'm going to take a little strip of razor foam. And this is, razor foam is like half millimeter thick, and I've cut it 2 or 3 millimeters wide. Again, that's just sort of my measurement from my eyeball. And I'm going to loop it over, like so. I'm going to lay this in about half the distance up the body. Tie that down with a few turns. Now, the reason I do the loop, cut these tag-ins out. The reason I do the loop is occasionally when you're fishing you need that indicator to be a little taller. Sometimes you're fishing in dark water, you can't quite see it. And that sounds dumb, I know, because these are, and I do this on a lot of big flies. Because you've got this big fly, you think it'd be really easy to see. Sometimes if you've got even a bright day, and you've got the reflection of the rocks on the bank, a tan fly is the same color as those rocks on the bank, and it doesn't show up. So I do put an indicator, even on a big fly, just as a finder, so it makes it easier to find the fly. But if you want that indicator, if you're fishing and you need it to be longer, you can reach in there and cut it at the bottom, and it'll stand up twice as tall. So you got an adjustable indicator, which I actually do a lot more often than I really thought I would. You know, I only ran into that a few times, and then once I started doing that, I find myself doing it a lot more. So I want to wrap right up to the base of that wing, and then I'm going to tie in a hackle feather. I don't like either of those. Are any of you guys hackle nuts? Maybe a little? You want to see the coolest saddle ever?
There are advantages to stoning the fly shot.
Well, there's an advantage to knowing Jake at Whiting, that's for sure.
That's that one around.
I didn't hear that.
Pass that one around.
You just want to touch it. So this is, I've actually, in all my days, never seen a saddle like this. If I hold it real still. This is not Cree. It's like barred ginger, badger, speckled. And Jake at Whiting, who's the guy that packages and grades everything, had never seen one either. And he said, I don't even know what to do with this. And I said, you don't need to worry about it, man. Just send it to me. And this is, and I've actually used it. I shouldn't use it so much because it's super cool. And it's, I don't know that it's any more, it's not any more effective than brown and grizzly mixed together, but it's just a really cool, you know, kind of mix of colors. Let me find a good feather here. Like look at that one. Like with that dark center with ginger barring. Some of them are like badger on one side and grizzly on the other. There's a great example. Yeah, just screwy little feathers. Look at that feather. You know, in the hackle industry, they call that dirty. It's just mixed up crazy colors. So I'm a big fan of this color. You should get some like this, but I can't sell it to you.
Do they put those special chickens out to stud or something? Or
Absolutely, absolutely. You know, the thing, I've worked with whiting for years, you know, and it's actually been really, Jake Bruno is the guy that I talk to there now. And it's really interesting because you would think, you know, like you think about dogs, you got this good dog and that good dog, you breed those two good dogs, you got another good dog. You may not. Apparently that's not the way it works. Like you may mix, you know, a brown and two great brown birds and you get a grizzly bird out of it. They're all weird recessive genes. Tom Whiting knows more about it than anybody on earth, and he's not a fly tyer. He's a chicken farmer. He is a PhD animal husbandry chicken farmer. He tried to hire me years ago before I opened my shop, and he called me. He actually called my dad's house. He looked him up in the phone book, and my dad has the same name as me. And he called my dad's house and left his number, and I called him, and we talked about this job, and I said, well, why don't you email me all that information? And he said, I don't do email. I'm a chicken farmer. And he still does it. I've never, to this day, gotten an email from Tom Whiting. I went over and took a tour of their outfit, and he has all of his breeding records on yellow legal pads. Every bird's got a band on its leg, and it's got a number, like a 4-digit number or a 5-digit number. So 1725 times 1634. That's the breeding records on stacks of yellow legal pads. And he knows, like he's out there all day, every day. Like he knows where they're coming from, trying to figure it out. But you know, I asked Jake, like, why can't you make that a color? And he's like, I'd love to make that. You know, of course they want to make that a color, but that's not how it works. It's not like, you know, we don't get a hen like that and a rooster like that and get that out of it. It doesn't come out of that. You know, like that came out of a brown bird. Is where that chick came from. It's a brown bird. You know, so it's like redheads. They just pop up.
how old is he?
How old is Tom? Yeah, so here's the thing, man. I hate when people ask stuff like that. I used to think everybody in the world was 50, but now I'm 50. So he's older. 70-ish? 70-ish? Yeah.
Those notes are at risk.
Yeah, his notes are at risk, yeah. Well, and Jake is a young guy. Jake's like maybe 35, and Jake is aware of that. Like, he's writing that stuff down, and, you know, they know that, you know, once anything goes wrong, they're screwed, so. Yeah, I have a good friend, Larry Fredericks, that I fish with on the Arkansas, that I fished with for 20 years. And Larry has always been 50 years old to me. And I fished him for 20 years, and I said to him, I said, he's not 50, like, Larry, how old are you? And he's 77. And he's like the toughest old cowboy guy that I've ever encountered. But he's 77, and you know, maybe that happens to everybody when you get to be 50, but like that was like a big thing for me. Like, I used to think everybody was 50, and now I'm 50. So I need to start meeting younger people. What's that?
Yeah.
50 was the good old days, was it? One of them? So what I just did there is I just trimmed some little stubble, get that where you can see it, down on the base of that feather. And that's so that when I tie this in, or when I go to wrap this, it's not going to pull out. And I'm going to tie this in. Now here's a great point, which I just remembered. I'm proud of myself for remembering. For some reason, when I put this little piece of foam in here, if I tie this feather in as I normally would, which would be the outside toward me, so that when I go to wrap it, it wraps outside forward. If I tie that in this way on top of that piece of foam, it will always twist this feather. And when I tied the samples for Umpqua, you know, all the ones that I tied for myself before that, I just fought and fought and fought and fought. When I sat down and tied 8 dozen samples for Umpqua in a row, I figured out that it was always doing that. So, being a near genius, I decided to turn the feather over and tie it in the wrong way to start, so that when it twisted, it was the right way. This is like really the only fly I'm going to do this ever on, but I'm going to tie that feather in with the inside out. Okay, so this is the inside concave side of the feather. I've got a weird little strand there.
Go back to the part where you're in near genius.
Near genius. I sit and tie in my office by myself, so I entertain myself a lot. But I also call myself an idiot about 85% of the time, because literally, I mean, I had tied 100 of them before I was like, you know, it turns every time. Maybe just put it in backwards.
Quick learner.
Yeah, quick learner, yeah. Yeah, I'm not a better fly tyer. I just make mistakes long before you guys do. So now I'm going to take some more of that same dubbing. And, you know, for that matter, it doesn't have to be the same dubbing. You could alternate this. You can do a different color, you know, if you wanted to mix this up a little bit.
I noticed you touched your overtones before you go.
Yes. I'm glad you mentioned that. So I don't put dubbing wax on my thread. There's no surface area on your thread. Like I started to say, I usually have pretty dry hands. My hands are pretty moist here, but I use dubbing wax to get a hold of the dubbing, like licking your finger to turn the page of the newspaper. So it's just to give me a little traction to twist the dubbing on. I'm not gluing the dubbing down. I'm not sticking it down. I'm using it to give me traction to twist it around the thread. So I just only put dubbing wax on my fingertip. And you can see there's like a finger dip right in the top of that from where I touch it. I quite literally have tied probably 1 million flies in my life, literally. And I've used this is my second tube of wax. So that tells you how much wax you should use per fly. This is my second one. I still have 1/8 of my first one left, you know, so Overton's went out of business, disappeared for 25 years, and I was just about to run out, and it came back, so I got 2 now. So little tiny bits of dubbing wax, but just enough to give you some adhesion. So I'm just going to dub a short little thorax there.
Do you think some ends up on the dub?
It does, because it's on my fingers, so there is a little bit on the dubbing. Yep, but that's why it's so little of it. You know, I say in my class, you know, I always tell people, like, you touch it. I just touch it. Invariably, you know, we'll tie the first fly with dubbing on it, and the dubbing wax comes back with a big scoop out of it, like it's ice cream, like somebody, you know, really got in there. It's just a touch. And just while I've been standing here doing that, I have way too much wax on my fingers now, just from touching it that many times. So now I'm going to take this feather and get it to turn the right way. There we go.
You find your flies get more complicated, the less likely you are to be the one who's tying them?
Not at all. I enjoy complicated flies. The worst thing in the world for me is to tie boring, simple flies. The mole fly is a boring, simple fly. It is a killer fly. I use a ton of them. I hate tying them because they're boring. And I back in the day, I used to love that stuff because it was money. Like I could tie lots of those flies cheap, and so my tastes have sort of changed. I like a complicated fly these days. All right. So I'm going to wrap this. And you can see this hackle, I didn't talk about it. This hackle is undersized. I don't need a big, tall hackle on this. I'm just creating some surface area. 3 or 4 turns through that thorax. Tie that feather off behind the foam. I'm going to trim that out. And I'm going to lift the foam up, and I'm going to build a little thread head underneath here. So several turns of thread. And all this is for is to make this fly easier to thread. I just want to prop that foam up a little bit. So when I go to tie my tippet on later, that foam's not flat down against the hook on it. I'll come in and whip finish. I'm going to trim this front piece of foam. You guys aren't going to have a great angle on this, but I'm going to set my scissors at a bit of an angle. So he's got a flat face, so that's sort of angled there. The reason for that, and the idea, like I said, on this fly was sort of taking the place of a chubby, but what I'd watch with chubs is with that flat piece, when you mend the fly, it would very often pull under. So I want that elevated, kind of almost like a popper face, so the fly skitters when you mend it rather than pull down. So now I'm going to pick up all my wing material. I'm going to trim this just about even, try to get my arm out of your way, even with the end of the body. And then I can cut this loop back here. Trim those legs just a little proud of the body on the back, and just a little proud of the wing on the front. And then I always trim this hackle on the bottom. So I'm going to pull this down. You can see I've got that pinched to my fingertips. I just bring my scissors right up flush. Usually I have to clean that up a little bit. And then I'll take just a shot of that same glue and put it right on the base of that hackle, right? Are you guys seeing what I'm seeing here? Right in the eye, yeah. Ideally, if you get it right in the eye. So that's just on that dubbing, right in the hackle, and that'll glue that hackle to the dubbing. And you can't do that on a fully wrapped hackle. It's something that you've trimmed, you can do that too. It makes a huge difference in how durable that hackle is. It never gets chewed off. So that is a Fat Angie. And that's been a really fun fly. That's kind of become my dry dropper fly the last couple years, just because it's new. That macrame yarn floats so good, it's really hard to argue with. This is a really buoyant fly. Typically I'll take it and I'll dunk it in Flyagra. Flyagra is the best stuff in the world for big foamy flies, especially if you do it ahead of time. You can do it on the water while you're fishing, but if you take your flies after you tie them, let the glue dry, and dip them in Flyagra, shake them off. And what I'll usually do is I grab in a pair of forceps, and I'll dip one, and then I'll kind of wipe it on all the other flies. You can kind of use it as a paintbrush, and then just set them on. I put them on a piece of tinfoil on my desk and just let them dry. And once you get that floating dried on there, that is embedded. It's paraffin and white gas is what that is. So you have a wax-coated fly, and the fly floats 1,000 times better if you let the floating dry on it. Everything floats better if you let your floating dry on it. I used to use yarn strike indicators made out of macrame yarn, and I would grease those up one day and have my clients fish with them, and I'd save the leaders and I'd put them on 2 magnets in the bed of my pickup truck. So the indicator was in there. And the next day they always floated better than they did the day before because that floating had a chance to dry. Drove back and forth to the river in the bed of my truck and got fluffed up and dried out. They float better when that floating is dried on there. So if you can grease your flies ahead of time, it makes a huge difference. So there's my pro tip for that one.
When do you decide to use super glue as opposed to UV resin?
So super glue is an adhesive. UV resin is not really an adhesive, it's a coating. So UV resin is going to be an external coating to shape things. Build a wing case or fill out a body shape like on the 2-bit hooker. But it's not a glue, it's not an adhesive. Super glue is an adhesive. So if you need something stuck to the hook, that's where I'd use super glue.
Charlie,
Yes, sir.
Macrame yarn,
instead of putting a drop of glue on the hackle underneath, do you ever put glue on your thread when you're wrapping it over to catch and trap the hackle?
No, so what, did you guys hear the question? if I put glue on the thread. Some guys,
Please,
what's that?
could you repeat the question?
So his question was if I ever put glue on, super glue on the thread, like to catch the hackle. And the reason I don't do that is because I want my thread torque to pull the fiber or whatever it is, hackle, whatever, pull it where I want it to go. If I put glue on it, where it touches is where it's stuck. So I don't put glue on the thread to do that. I'll tie it down where I want it and then glue it in place. What you create is catchy thread. So whatever you touched it to first is where it's stuck. And it's never where I want it the first time. I have to kind of position it. So there was another one.
Is macrame yarn zero absorbency like EP fiber?
EP fiber is nylon. EP fiber is nylon. It'll soak up water. Yes, this is waterproof.
And how about on the legs? Do you ever try Perfect brand legs?
Perfect rubber is silicone, and it's buoyant, and I have used it. The catch with the Perfect rubber, it has glitter in it, so there's little weak spots in those legs, and they do tend to break off more often. That would work on there though. I've used that on green drakes, and I've used it on a lot of nymphs over the years, but I do notice that it breaks where the glitter is. It's just like silly legs too. The glitter stuff looks cool, but it doesn't hold up very good because that glitter is a weak spot. It's not a solid piece of silicone. It's got a break in it somewhere along there. Keep going with questions. I'm just going to clean this mess up. How are we doing?
Let's shoot for one more
Okay.
and see what the timing looks like
Sure.
at that point.
Sure.
I noticed that you use different manufacturers of hooks. So what kind of criteria do you use when you are in the lab deciding on what kind of hook you want to use?
So the hook, it depends on what I'm going for. This fly, I wanted, when I first started tying them, we were on straight hooks, like 52, 62, like a straight nymph hook. This fly, one of the ideas or thoughts on this was a fly better than a chubby. I fish chubbies a lot up in Wyoming, and fish will blast them. They get eaten. I mean, it's a dumb, classless fly. I don't like it. I don't like the fly, but they do eat it. And it's a great indicator fly. But one of the things I saw when fish really blasted is it's such a buoyant fly, it'd get pushed out of the water. Ride the bow wave off their head. So I wanted a fly that set lower in the water, that stuck to the water better. So like when I tie chubbies, I tie them with a really shaggy body, so they're kind of wet on the belly, so they stick to the water. And that was the idea of this hook, is getting that back end kind of stuck down, sitting a little, still a tall profile, but something that's stuck to the water a little bit better. And it also gives it an entirely different profile than a chubby. A lot of, especially in Colorado these days, because there's so many people now, a lot of it is not throwing the same chubby with a Pat's rubber leg under it as the 13 boats in front of you, which is what every guide in Colorado wants to do all day long, because it's a big fly on the bottom, you fish heavy tippet, you good odds of landing the fish for clients. I understand that. But when you're boat number 14 throwing a tan chubby with an olive Pat's rubber leg underneath it, it doesn't take much to be a little different than that. So the whole idea of this was all the things a chubby does, but not a chubby. Something more bug-like than a chubby.
Charlie, last time you were here, you were talking about chubbies, and at that time, you were thinking that your foam bugs, you wanted them to be a little bit wider instead of higher. You still...
Well, so a chub wing is, because it's yarn, the height, it doesn't come from the foam, it comes from the yarn.
No, I mean the foam.
Yeah,
You wanted the foam to be wider.
Wider than tall, yes. Yeah, they should be wider than tall. Yep. All right, I'm going to show you this one. This one is the one that my sister-in-law wanted a fly named after. My sister-in-law's name is Suzanne. And I actually knew her before I met my wife. I went to high school with both of them, but I didn't know my wife in high school. She was older. She still is older. She's still older. She's only like 6 months older than me, but she was in the class ahead of us, and her sister was in my class. And so I've actually been really good friends with her sister for a long time, and we tease each other endlessly, but she's been nagging me to tie a fly and name it after her. And she likes wine, so this fly is called the Drunken Susie, which is a yellow Sally pattern. And it just occurred to me the other day, I was doing something, and I wrote it down, and I was like, why didn't I call it the Boozy Susie? Like, that would have been even better. But this is sort of a cool technique fly. It's got a few different angles to it for a yellow Sally. And you'll see here when I tie it, you can obviously tie this for a variety of different bugs, caddis and small stoneflies, even bigger stoneflies for that matter. And you'll see I've been working with this macrame yarn a lot. I really like this. It's so buoyant. It's so you don't need to maintain it. You can catch a fish, make a couple of false casts, and put it back out on the water, and it floats again. It's not something you got to fight with constantly.
Where'd you buy it?
I first bought it at craft stores. Now I buy it in bulk from the manufacturer. It's Bonnie is the name of the company. And, the catch is it's I don't know, $16 or $18 a spool. It's a 100-yard spool. So I mean it's a good deal, but it'll take you 1,000 years to use up 100 yards. We sell it in the shop, and I think we've bought, and we sell a lot of it. I think we bought 2 spools of each in 2 years. It goes a long way. Yeah, I think we put a yard in a package, which I think is a lifetime supply. All right, so this one is going to be tied on a Tiemco 100 SPBL. And so this is, if you guys aren't familiar with this hook, if I hold that just right, it's got that spear-shaped point. It's a barbless hook, but it's got a spear-shaped point. It's also 1.5 heavy wire, so it's stouter than a standard dry fly hook. And this is sort of my go-to hook for any dry fly. I like these heavier wire hooks for a couple of reasons. One is because I only catch big fish. And 2 is because tippet has gotten a lot stronger. The last couple of years, every company has come out with new tippet. And it's ridiculously strong now. Steel is still the same as it was 20 years ago. So this is as good a hook as you can get. This is an expensive hook. It's a well-tempered hook, and it's still strong enough to hold the fish. There's a lot of cheap hooks. I say all the time, you can get cheap hooks or you can get good hooks. They're never the same. If hooks are cheap, you know why they're cheap. They're not very strong. If you fish for little fish, they're fine. If you fish for big fish, you'll be mad. So I don't spare the expense on the hook. Don't save the nickel there. This is not a cheap hook, but it's the best dry fly hook I've used. So I'm going to start with some 30 denier Semperfli Nano Silk, which is very small gel spun. It really is there. There it is. Gel spun polyethylene, and this is yellow. The color doesn't make a huge difference because it's not going to show a ton. But I'm going to use this gel spun for the head part. This thread is really small and super strong, and it lays pretty flat on the hook. So a lot of advantages to it. One of the disadvantages to it is it's very slippery. So when you dub on this thread, your dubbing slides around a lot. It can be hard to start on the hook. You got to kind of make an extended jam knot to get it to stick down. So other than that, you could almost use it for everything. The color doesn't stick to it great. Gel spun just doesn't hold dye very well. Semperfli is the best stuff I've found. Gel spun thread's been around for a long time, but invariably all the stuff we used, UTC and Uni both made it. You'd get halfway through a spool and it'd just blow up. It would tangle on itself like a backlash in a bait caster. This stuff, knock on wood, I have not had that happen at all with any of my spools in Nano Silk. So I don't know if they just spool it differently or if it's maybe a slightly different thread. It's just gel spun, so it's the same material, but this is the best I've found. So for the tag on this, a yellow Sally is a little small, kind of caddis size, little yellow stonefly. And they've got an orange butt on them. So I'm going to use this is Glow Bright, and that's number 4, which I think is called Flame. And I'm going to take a length of this, like so, and double it over, and then double it over again. So I've got 4 strands of that. I'm going to catch that here at the front end. I'll draw that down to length. I'm going to wrap over it right up to the bend of the hook. And then for the body, I'm going to use Mirage tinsel. And this throws a lot of people off. I use Mirage tinsel on a lot of stuff. and this is a yellow bug. People say, why do you use tinsel for the body? One of the cool things about tinsel is it picks up the colors around it. So it's not tinsel colored, it's green if it's around green stuff. It's yellow if it's around yellow stuff. So it's just going to mirror back the colors around it. So it's pretty variable. And I think that's one of the reasons why it works so well. I use it on a lot of my flies, but I think that's one of the reasons it works so well is it kind of matches in, not just with the rest of the materials on the fly, but the color of the light that particular day. It's not sticking out. It's not a gray day with a bright yellow body. It kind of tones itself down a little bit. It's just going to mirror back whatever colors are around it. So I'm going to tie that in at the front, and I'm going to wrap this tinsel from front to back. And then from back to front. So I've got a double layer tinsel body here. I want to anchor that down good and tight. Now I'll trim this tag. I usually leave that long just in case something blows up in the meantime. I'll try to do this with my hand not in the way. So just at the bend of the hook, just short little tag. Okay, just a little hot spot. Now the same thing we did for the bee, but I'm going to use some yellow yarn here. And one of the things when you do this with the loop, you got to keep in mind that you don't need near as much as you're inclined to use. And I still have to say that to myself every time I tie them. Because we're going to double this up, finds our focus here, there we go. Because we're going to double this up in a loop, you can go pretty sparse on this. But really the same move I just did with that yarn for the bee, I'm going to fold that in half, kind of roll it up into a tight little loop. One of the most noticeable things about a yellow Sally is that flat wing that lays flat over their back. These do skitter a lot in the water, so their wings will be out, but I want this wing to kind of be tight and just be on the end of the tail. And I'm going to lay that in flat and catch that with a few turns. And I'm going to go back about 1/4 of a shank. I know you guys have a weird angle on the camera there, but I'm about 25% of the way back from the hook eye. And then I can trim that front end out. Now for the head on this, I'm going to make a dubbing loop after I find my dubbing whorl. So I'm going to draw out a bit of thread, and I don't need much here, but this is a Dyna King dubbing whorl, and it works like a plumb bob. There's a lot of different ones of these in the world, but this is the one I've always used. And I'm going to catch the thread in those two hooks, so just a bit more, cross the thread around it to close that loop. So I've just made, get that where you can see it, a loop that's between those legs there. You guys can't see this, but with the spring on my vise here, I'm going to take one leg of that loop and put it in the spring on my vise, and that'll keep that from twisting up with my thread while I do whatever else it is I need to do. If you leave that hanging and fool around for a minute and you look back at it, it'll be in a giant knot every time. So one leg in the loop there. So now for the head, I'm going to take a little pinch of dubbing, and it really, again, this, people think I'm telling you a story. It doesn't matter what dubbing you use here, because we're just going to use this as the vehicle to get our head. We're going to put some materials in this dubbing loop. We're going to put deer hair, CDC, and this little bit of dubbing in this dubbing loop.
So are you doing a loop because the gel spun doesn't take the dubbing very well?
No, I'm doing the loop because I'm going to put some deer hair in here. You'll see what I'm going to do. I'm going to make a hackle. I'm going to physically make a hackle that's made out of more than one material, a compound loop. The reason I use gel spun though is because I'm using deer hair in here, and when I spin this, that gel spun doesn't have any stretch and it's very strong, and it'll actually compress the deer hair just like spinning it. I'll hold it. I can't put this where you guys can see it, so I'll hold this up once I get it together. But I'm going to take that little pinch of dubbing there and just set it on my table. Then I'm going to take a CDC feather. Get a nice one out of here. And again, you could do this for a caddis in yellow. I just got a good view of the back of my head. There's a lot of gray in there. Thanks for not mentioning that.
I asked Steve one time
You
and
didn't?
said that she felt like I had white out in my I told her this, yeah.
I said, no. And now you're grounded. My son, I work with my oldest son, and his favorite thing is to randomly take a picture of the back of my head and send it to me. Like, yeah, I know there's not much hair back there, and I know it's gray. All right, so what I've got here, I've actually got 2 CDC feathers. The 2 that if you've got a thicker one will do, but I've just evened them up. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this clump, I'm going to peel it off so I've just got loose CDC fibers. I'm going to take that clump and I'm going to set it right on top of that dubbing. And I'll hold this up here as soon as I get it put together. Then I'm going to take a little pinch of deer hair. And this is coastal deer that's dyed yellow. And for all of you that are going to call the shop and say, I don't see coastal deer dyed yellow on your site, that's because I had to dye this on my kitchen stove. They don't make it yet. I'm trying to talk Thomas into doing it, but there's been such a shortage of deer hair, he hasn't done it yet. But what I want, and you can do this with natural deer hair, and for a caddis, I would just use natural deer. But what I'm going to do here is I'm going to pull a little clump of this out. And then I want to clean the underfur out. So I'm going to hold it by the tip ends and get all the underfur out of it. But I'm not going to stack it. You can see coastal deer is pretty square to start with, but I want those kind of random lengths. I don't want it perfectly stacked. I'm going to take this clump of deer and lay it right on top of that CDC. So now on my tabletop, I've got dubbing, CDC, and deer hair. And honestly, this tool, this is a dubbing loop tweezer, which is super handy for this kind of thing. But until I got one of these last year, I just picked this up with my fingers. I just slide my scissors under it, pick it up, and stick it in the dubbing loop. This does make it easier, and certainly makes it easier in demos for you guys to see what it is I just did. Okay. See the long strands of CDC that are kind of dangling out there? I've got this a little too far from the tips, so I'm going to move it over a bit, like so. So now what I'll do is I'm going to take my long bladed scissors and I'm going to cut this end off. I want to leave myself a little stub. Don't cut it flush. I want to leave a little stub so I've got something to put in my dubbing loop. And I don't usually do that up on top of my vise, but so now I'm going to take this and I'm going to put that in between the 2 strands of thread and open it up. I'm going to pinch that dubbing loop right underneath that hair and spin the loop. And that hair will start to spin up into a really cool, kind of sparkly CDC deer hair laden hackle. And now I'm going to use this to build the head. So this is going to be kind of the legs and head of the fly. And so I'm going to treat this like a hen feather, like for a soft apple. So as I start to wrap this, I'll kind of fold this back. And those butt ends will form like a little deer hair head. And the tip ends will form the collar. I'll tie that off just behind the hook eye there. Trim that thread out. Just a little thread head to tighten everything up there. This is really one of the cool things about GSP thread is you can tighten down anything in the world with it. And you can make 14 wraps at the head of the fly and it will not build a thread head. It's tiny. So you always have a clean little thread head. So now I'm going to take this dubbing deer hair, etc. on the bottom, and just pull it down flat and trim it straight flat across the bottom. But I'm going to leave everything else kind of long and ragged.
And this is the Drunken Susie?
Drunken Susie is what this one is. If you've got any extra long, you can kind of trim them off the front. I like kind of a little bullet head, but I like to leave them pretty ragged.
How well does it fly?
This fly is actually surprising. There's a lot of deer hair on that fly. You saw the size of that clump of deer hair?
Yeah.
That's all kind of packed in a small area. So it's got CDC and deer hair and polypropylene macrame yarn. So a pretty buoyant little fly that sits low on the water. And I've got, I don't know if you guys remember the streaming banshee, a little skating caddis pattern I did years ago. That's what I use for a skating fly. But so many of these yellow sallies, they just sit on the water and they just drift along. They're not running. They're just. I wanted a fly that imitated it, just dead drifted. Not a lot of yellow sally patterns are busy flies, like a stimulator that you could skate. But if you got a fish that's really eating them, and they do hatch. They hatch like tricos. There's droves of them. You get fish that start to be selective on them. You need something that's a little bit more realistic, and that's where the idea for this came from. And like I say, I've tied this for, with that grizzly bear color yarn we just used on the Fat Angie, with natural deer and natural CDC for a caddis. That's a really good caddis pattern. And I fished that. You can put a green tag on it for an egg layer. I fish that as both a dry and as a nymph. Fish it as a pupa under the water. Both of these flies, that's one thing people don't know about yellow sallies also, is they hatch like a mayfly. They don't hatch like a stone. So they actually pop out in the water. They hatch on the water instead of crawling out on rocks like every other stonefly in the world. So having a fly that sits low and can kind of be trapped is a pretty good one. But that's a different technique than what we've used on a lot of this other stuff. So that's why I wanted to show you that one. Just a different way to kind of combine different materials, even on a little fly. You see a lot of that stuff on big streamer stuff these days. You can scale that down. It's just a matter of where you can apply it. So.
Use agra on that too, or the agra?
On a fly like this, actually, because it's got CDC in it, I use Tiemco Dry Magic. So anything that's got CDC on it that comes in a skinny white tube, that's the best stuff I found for CDC. It's just a very light, thin. I imagine this fly, honestly, it doesn't have a ton of CDC on it. You probably could use fly agar on it just fine. But I typically use Dry Magic on it.
How does it emerge? It floats up from the bottom and, or pupate?
It doesn't pupate. The nymph swims up to the surface and cracks down. It hatches just like a stonefly does on dry ground, except it does it in the water.
It floats and does it?
Yep.
It is a stonefly, though, isn't it?
It is a stonefly. Yep.
So you use coastal deer, what do you use? What's the advantage of that?
Coastal deer is short, fine-tipped deer hair. So all the nomenclature on hair these days is a little confusing. They say, yeah, I know exactly what you mean. There's humpy deer, there's hopper deer, there's coastal deer, there's compared deer. There's a really good chapter in that basic fly tying book on hair. But what you're looking for on all hair is proportion to your hook size. You want hair that has a short, abrupt tip. So if you're fishing or you're tying a very small fly, you need hair that has a really short tip. That's what coastal hair is short hair that doesn't have a long wispy tip. If you look at spinning deer, what they sell as spinning deer, that comes from the back and rump of a deer, and very often the tips of that are really wispy because very often they're cut off. You're going to spin a hair bug and you're going to cut that off. That does not make a very good wing because even when you stack it, if you're going to tie a size 14 fly, the whole length of the shank would be solid black tip. A wispy tip, no hollowness to it. So you want hair that is abruptly tapered rather than a long wispy tip. So you get a lot of hollowness close to the tip so that you can flare the hair or shape the hair. And between coastal and humpy and yearling is really just proportion difference. How long the hair is and how close the barring is to the tip of the hair.
Any other questions? I know a lot of people wanted to get to Charlie's books. We're going to cut off the time here. We're going to have a short business meeting, and then Charlie will be back there selling and signing books. So, Charlie, thank you.